Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, the Batteries Regulation, Enabling Sustainable and Competitive EU Value Chains. My name's David Rose, I'll be your moderator for the next 90 minutes. And before I give you a little bit of an introduction and framing to today's webinar, I'd like to highlight to you the hashtag you can see on your screen for today's event, Batteries4EU, and we look forward to seeing a very vivid stream of tweets from our audience. Now, talking about you, our audience, we've got over 400 registered participants for this webinar. I think underlining the importance of this discussion that we're going to have today with the upcoming trialogue on the batteries regulation. We've got over 400 people, not just from Europe, but also from Asia, from Africa, and the US as well. So a very warm welcome to you wherever you are, and that will also explain why I'm not saying good morning or good afternoon due to differences in time zones. So, batteries regulation then. I think as many of you will know, the current batteries directive is from 2006. And in December 2020, the Commission published its legislative proposal for a new batteries regulation, clearly aiming to look at batteries being placed in the EU market being sustainable and safe throughout their life cycle. Now, the batteries regulation is expected to be a blueprint, if you like, a groundbreaker for future EU product legislation. So, of course, scrutiny from all stakeholders is very high at this stage as we enter into trialogue. Now, what's the Parliament position? We know the Commission's position, of course, on this, but what's the Parliament's position? Well, MEPs, members of the European Parliament, in their published press releases and statements on this issue, have shown that they want more environmental and social ambition. They want batteries to be more sustainable and easier to replace, including for smartphones and similar devices. In terms of due diligence, they want standards across the entire battery value chain and covering additional battery metals, just to mention a few: copper, iron, bauxite, as well as a mineral, and risk categories as well. And they want more ambitious timelines and targets. Now, I can give an example of this in terms of lithium. The proposed 35% lithium recovery rate in the Commission's legislative proposal, the Parliament are calling for that ambition to be raised to 90% by 2030. I repeat, 90%. Now, in terms of the European Council, of course, the third party in the trilogue discussions, they're staying a little closer to the Commission's proposal when it comes to the batteries regulation. The Council wants to promote development of sustainable and safe battery production chains throughout the life cycle. They also emphasise strongly the need for a level playing field in the internal market to ensure that when we come to end of life for batteries, that they'll be properly collected and they won't simply be discarded in the environment. And also from the perspective of environment, also preventing any hazardous substances from being released into the environment, and also with a focus on circular economy to limit the wasting of relevant raw materials that could be recovered in the context of the circular economy. So there are some divergences or differences in these positions between Commission, of course, and Council and Parliament, which we'll be looking at today. So today's event then, what's our overarching aim today? Well, we want to debate the remaining opportunities that there are moving into the trialogue on the batteries regulation. Opportunities to ensure that the output of those discussions and the final batteries regulation is one that balances both sustainability and competitiveness for EU battery value chains. And in particular, there's opportunities to make the batteries regulation more efficient, particularly from the perspective of industry, in terms of more efficient in producer definition and the grandfather clause, hazardous substance restrictions, carbon footprint, recycled content, and due diligence. So with these framing comments in mind, I'd like to now just give you a little bit of an overview of our event today and how we're going to approach this discussion on enabling sustainable and competitive EU value chains. As you can see clearly, I'll finish my brief introduction and we'll get straight down to business with our panel, which I'll introduce in just a few moments, involving all of our key stakeholders. We have a member of the European Parliament, we have representatives of NGO and industry, and then we'll, following the panel, have someone from the Cabinet of the European Commission, of the Commissioner, to give us some reflections on our panel, and then I'll wrap things up for a nice prompt finish. But before we move into our panel and we bring in our speakers, I want to hear the views of you, our audience, As well as during the panel, you'll have opportunities to pose your questions to our speakers. We want to get a little bit of a feel for your views on this subject to share with our panel before we start. So I've got 2 poll questions for you that I'm going to invite you to take a look at and answer. Our first poll question, which will be coming on your screen in just a moment: will the future regulation, the batteries regulation, ensure that only sustainable batteries are placed on the EU market? And we'd like you to choose one of those options. Yes, it will, if they're properly enforced. I don't know. Yes, it definitely will. No, it won't, because it's too easy for the non-compliant batteries to be placed on the market. Or no, it definitely won't. It's not fit for purpose. So I'll just give you 15, 20 seconds to share your views on that, everyone. Right, well, I think we can see a clear front runner here from our audience. I think there's a very positive outlook. People feel that the regulation will ensure that sustainable batteries and only sustainable batteries are placed on the market if we have robust, correct enforcement. In an equal second place at this stage, I don't know. I think people are waiting to see perhaps a little bit what we hear today in our debate. But also there's a fifth of our audience moving towards no, because they have concerns about non-compliant batteries being too easily placed on the market. Right. In just a moment now I'm going to close this poll, so do get your votes in, please. And I'm going to move then to our second poll question. Will the batteries regulation foster a stronger and more globally competitive batteries value chain in Europe, which is ultimately its aim? So again, ranging from yes to no, you've got your options to choose, and please choose away. So a similar picture is emerging here as to our first question as well. Approximately half of our audience are confident that if the ongoing trilogue discussions also factor in industry concerns, that there's definitely an opportunity for that endpoint to be achieved. But on the flip side, we also have a certain number of people who are not sure, but equally people who are concerned that it won't allow Europe, on the competitiveness side of things, to make the steps forward that it clearly needs. So again here now, as I see, we still have a slight evolution, but to keep time today, I will now close this poll, and let's move into our panel. So as you can see on the screen in just a moment, we've got 4 speakers making up our panel today. In speaking order, we have Antonius Manders, a member of the European Parliament from the EPP group and the Rapporteur for the IMCO committee. Patrick de Metz, who's Corporate Government and Environmental Affairs Director at Saft Batteries, Chairman of Recharge and Eurobat Batteries Regulation Task Force Chair. Jan Tigdat, the Director of Government Affairs for EU Benelux for IMCO, Board Member of Recharge, and also Chair of the Eurometaux Trade Committee. And last but not least, Julia Poliscanova, who's the Senior Director of Vehicles and E-Mobility at Transport and Environment. So having introduced our speakers, I'll now move into our panel. So first of all, a very warm welcome to all of our speakers, and thanks for joining us today. I see, as is traditional fashion in a good virtual debate, we have a wide range of very engaging backgrounds for our speakers as well. So, as you all know, we want to start off today with a key question for each of you. So, Antonius, I'll pose it first to you. Patrick, then to you. Jan, you will take the third. And then Julia, finally, but not last but not least, on to you. And my opening question, when we're looking at this balance between sustainability and competitiveness for batteries value chains with the batteries regulation, is quite a simple one. Ahead of the trilogue discussions, what do you consider key in the batteries regulation to ensure that this aim of sustainability and competitiveness is successfully achieved? So, Antonius, I'll hand over to you for a couple of minutes for your initial views on that, please.
Well, that's actually thank you for your question. In my view, this proposal is exactly the solution for the future. If we need to balance between sustainability and the competitiveness of European industry. That's why in IMCO we introduced already, and I thank Simona Bonafé in Envy as rapporteur, that she copied that, due diligence on the value chain and not only on the supply chain. All the defenders of the supply chain, it's an old, how you call it, it's an old reflex. That was when we are only doing business within Europe. But since we have a global economy, we need to be competitive on a global level. And all the European industries really have to comply with social and with environmental standards. So if we introduce now a high level of standards on the due diligence, that means that an SME in China also have to comply with these standards. And if not, then they are not allowed to do business within the EU. And then we make our industry compatible with competitive with let's say global industries. And that's for the future is good for our jobs, for the future is good for our economy, and is good for the sustainability. And since what we see nowadays, the war at the eastern border of in Ukraine, the eastern border of Europe, our eyes are open that we have to be more independent from third countries. And that's why I think it's a pity that Envy didn't support the closed material loop that we introduced in IMCO. So for example, an export ban of waste batteries to force the European industry to recycle the waste batteries to get out the raw materials and to produce new ones. That's why I think it's a pity that they didn't support the idea of introducing a deposit scheme for consumer batteries. And everybody says, yeah, but it takes too long and it's too expensive, etc., etc. But if we use that money, so you pay 50 cents as a deposit, you get it back when your battery is empty, bring it back, you get your money back. But then in those 2 years, you have a huge amount of money which you can invest in developing and innovation in battery cell productions of European raw materials. And then we are working on the future, not by defending it. And then I will close my remarks. I always copy Johan Cruyff. Johan Cruyff was the famous football player and one of our best and most famous philosophers of the last 100 years. He always said, and that's only for football, but I think it's in complete life, you have to attack to score goals, because if you're not scoring goals, you never can win. And if you only defend what we got, then we will lose at the end. And I think we have to open our eyes. We have to dare to take to protect ourselves in the future. Thank you. And open for questions, of course.
Of course. Thanks very much, Antonius. I particularly note there your comments about how you feel then that the batteries regulation is the right forward-looking way to balance competitiveness and sustainability. Your comments about the link between relevant due diligence and global competitiveness. And also, I think we all noted your comments about the great Dutch philosopher Johan Cruyff as well, in that call to be bold and attack to score goals. With that in mind, I'll pose exactly the same question. What do you consider key in a batteries regulation to ensure and balance sustainability and competitiveness? Patrick, to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Let me first say that the European battery industry fully supports the intention, the goals, and the mechanisms that are introduced in this proposed regulation. We're in full support. We believe that they're going to help the European industry differentiate itself from the competition that's coming from several parts of the world. All the mechanisms, all the right mechanisms are there. I mean, there is extended producer responsibility, which, by the way, was already present in the existing directive since 2006. We have CO2 footprint and performance requirements. We have recycled contents requirements. We have hazardous substance management procedures. We have a whole sections to promote the reuse of batteries through their remanufacturing or repurposing. And we also have a due diligence on the supply chain. So all these mechanisms are there, and they are key. They will be key to ensure this differentiation and the success that we try to achieve together. This being said, I've done some counting here. The directive which we have today is a 14-page long document, which has been in place since 2006, 14-page long document with 4 implementing acts. The proposed regulation we have today is over 130 pages long, 13 annexes, and it is expected that approximately 30 implementing acts will be written, built, drawn up, and implemented over the coming years. So from 14 pages to 130 pages and 30 delegated acts. There will be a lot of details here to look at. Industry regulators will have to look at a lot of details. And what I just want to say here is that the devil is in the details, and there will be a lot of details in this regulation. So my message here is 2 points. Details have to be worked out very carefully because the devil is there. Point number 1, and point number 2, which has been indicated by Representative Manders, Member of Parliament Manders, I mean, it is indeed enforcement, fair enforcement and equal enforcement across batteries placed on the European market, irrelevant of where they have been manufactured. There will be many batteries imported into the European market. As such, batteries imported in the market embedded into vehicles, batteries imported into the European market embedded into appliances and equipment. We need to make sure that enforcement will be done equally across all of these products coming from overseas and products made in-house. So 2 points: details, proper details, and enforcement.
Okay, a clear cap at the end there, Patrick. Thank you very much. So echoing what we heard previously from Antonius, but also your point about concern with complexity now of this iteration of batteries legislation at a European level, and a potential risk that if the details are not fully considered in such a complex document, we could end up with potentially overly prescriptive legislation, which creates difficulties in implementation. And your point about enforcement, echoing what we heard from Antonius, is also noted. With those elements in mind, Jan, I'll hand over to you now to also bring your views on this question about what's key in the batteries regulation to ensure the balance of sustainability and competitiveness for European value chains.
Okay, thank you, David. I refer also to the first part of your question, which was, and I read ahead of the trilogue discussions. So I think indeed we are now in a very crucial part of the lawmaking. I have to say that the Commission proposal, as it was proposed already more than a year ago, we think it was quite a balanced proposal, balanced in the sense that there are several values that are important and that they were in a good equilibrium. And also the targets, both in terms of time as in figures, were or are assessed and supported by scientific evidence. So if now in the next phase with the trilogue, there might be there are proposals to change some of these timelines and numeric targets, well, I expect that those changes will be assessed as well as the initial objectives. Because if we would go away from science-based targets to just intuitive numbers and objectives, that could be a problem. Within the European Battery Alliance, we have been working on roadmaps, and those roadmaps have timelines. And those timelines are taken over in the proposals from the Commission. If we now would say, well, no, that's all not going to work, it has to be faster, or recycling recovery rates, that's not ambitious enough, it should be higher. Well, I hope that in the final proposals or the adopted text, that those new targets and timelines will be assessed as well as in the Commission's proposal. In 2 years' time, there could be indeed some evolutions that justify changes in those timelines and targets, but it has to be assessed and not just like this. No? Okay. So that's my main message. And indeed, as Patrick said, the devil is in the details. So in the upcoming implementing acts and delegated acts, there will also be a lot of need for science-based approaches. That's important.
Okay, so a clear, I think, message and takeaway from your initial comments there definitely is that the design of the Commission proposal was evidence-based and balanced from your perspective as a consequence. Yep. And it's essential then in trialogue that balance is not overly disrupted and that any changes are equally science-based and evidence-based rather than perhaps more oriented towards, can we say, opinion versus evidence fact. Okay. Okay, with these points in mind then, Julia, I hand over to you now again with ahead of the trialogue. What do you consider key in the batteries regulation to balance sustainability and competitiveness? Also bearing in mind the, of course, clear comments we've heard from our previous three speakers as well. So Julia, I pose that question to you.
Thanks, David, and thanks a lot for also having TNE at this event. So I would actually like to start by turning the question around. It is not sustainability versus competitiveness and the balance between the two. Sustainability of European batteries is the competitive advantage that European industry has against the world, against, for example, Asian manufacturers. And actually, it's not just about the greenest batteries for climate. It's also about where the industry is going. Car makers are now all lowering down their own carbon emissions. They are asking for clean nickel, clean steel, low carbon batteries. So this is the competitive edge of the industry. In terms of trialogues, for us, there are 3 points that we're looking for on which we will be judging how good the proposals are and whether or not they are at the level that they should be. First of all, on the carbon footprint, so the CO2 thresholds for batteries. This is really where competitive advantage of many European battery manufacturers is, because our cleaner grids give us a big advantage over, for example, batteries produced in Korea or China. So we need to ensure two things. First of all, we need to have robust and quick implementation of carbon footprint provisions. So we really support the European Parliament there to make sure that it's integrated into the business case of the upcoming battery factories. And two, we need to make sure that these are real CO2 reductions, not just CO2 reductions on paper. So just using guarantees of origin, or GOs as they're better known, is not okay. If a company needs to prove that their low carbon footprint is indeed as low as they claim, you need to be using power purchase agreements or just on-site renewables. So that's important. It's about the real reductions. It's not about reportings or papers. The second really important area is around circularity, and that is around, especially from our side as TNE, the material recovery targets. If we look at lithium, and I would like to maybe say something different from what Jan from IMCO was just saying, if we look at what's happening in the market, it's not about roadmaps, targets, timelines, it's about urgency and strategic autonomy of Europe. Have you seen the lithium prices recently? They have increased 750% in the last year. We don't produce much lithium in Europe today, but we do have a lot of lithium in our phones and computers, but also driving around. So we simply cannot afford to waste that urban mining opportunity at the time when lithium is so scarce. And we are very concerned about proposals by both European Commission, but especially the Council, that would make us wait to recover even 1/3 of lithium until 2029. We cannot wait a decade. We need to go a lot closer to what the European Parliament have voted. Companies in America, in China are doing this already. We should be able to do it in Europe as well. And the last point I will add on where the third broader point on broader sustainability, looking beyond just emissions, it's about responsible sourcing of materials and due diligence. We really support proposals there from both European Parliament and Council. They strengthened the environmental criteria and risks, the human rights criteria, so it's really strong. European Parliament is right to also extend it to copper, iron and bauxite, because actually we mine copper and cobalt together in places such as Congo. But I would like to just put some caution on some things in the Council. Again, we worry about the delays proposed in the Council. We are mining metals now for the batteries that we will still be using in Europe, in new factories. So we need to set these requirements soon to incorporate it into that business case. We also should be careful not to rely on the industry schemes too much. So industry schemes can be good. The global IRMA standard is very good, but they can be less good. But ultimately, the responsibility with securing that things are done well is with a company, not with a scheme. And that should be very clear in the regulation. Thank you, and really very much looking forward to the discussion.
Indeed. Now, before we launch into that discussion, because we've heard a lot of key points coming across from the initial comments from our speakers, I'd like to firstly thank our audience for the large amount of questions which are coming in via the Slido feed, and reassure you, keep them coming, and I'll take the opportunity the best I can to pose those to our speakers. A little note on my side though, with 400 plus people registered for this event and following across 4 continents, the volume of questions I receive will far exceed our time budget to pose them all and answer them in a reasonable way. So I'll be trying my best to select the most representative questions from our audience to share a little later with our panel. But first I'd like to give the floor to our panellists just for their reflections on what they've heard from each other. We've heard some different views here. For example, Julia bringing the transport environment view at the end there, that perhaps in contrary to what she'd heard from Jan, she sees that it's more a question not of targets and time, but for example, of strategic autonomy. So I'd like to open up the floor. Jan, I'll let you pick that up first, and then I'll leave the floor open for you.
I was addressed personally and directly by Julia, so thank you, Julia, to challenge me and my position here. When I said that the Commission proposal was balanced and the roadmaps and science-based, etc., I also said that in the 2 years between the setting up the targets and the drafting of the proposal and today, we have already made a lot of progress. And I think lithium is exactly an example where we could say, well, in the meantime, a lot of things happened. What's the problem with lithium is in fact that today in Europe, there is no refining capacity for lithium. And if we start doing recycling in Europe, we have to make sure that this goes hand in hand with building up refining capacity. Because what will happen if there is no refining capacity in Europe, we will make some intermediates. Those intermediates will be shipped to, let's call it China, or even worse, to Russia, where there is refining capacity. And if it is in Russia, you never know, will it come back? If it is in China, it will come back into the form of batteries and not as lithium hydroxide or lithium carbonate. So my plea here is, let's develop that indeed together. And okay, the roadmaps, which are 2 years, 3 years old, they have to be reviewed from time to time. And with the current knowledge that we have today, we think that indeed for lithium, the initial Commission proposed targets of 35 and 70 could be reviewed with what we know today. Because what we have seen the last several years is enormous investments in production capacity, including refining of lithium in Europe. And so if the lithium recycling could go hand in hand with the primary production refinery in Europe, then we have an interesting business model that could indeed go to higher and more ambitious targets.
Right, thanks very much.
But that's what I meant. If we make new targets and new timelines, it should be assessed. We have to think about it and not say bluntly, boof, it should be like this. That's my message.
Okay, so evidence-based versus arbitrary targets. Antonius, Patrick, I'd like to bring you in here as well on this.
Yeah, who is? I got the floor or not? Yes. Well, thank you. I want to explain a little bit the words of Patrick, but also Jan and Julia, of course, because Jan shows now that the industry has some fear about the future. They say we first have to prove it, and then we are ready for it, and then we introduce the legislation. But as a politician, you have to have a view in the future. You have to have a dream. And if you are not convinced that the society will take it over, then we can bury the EU for the future. That's what my really that's my conviction.
Antonius, if I could just come in briefly there. If I could just come in briefly there, Antonius. One of our audience members posed a question which really caught my attention. Your point duly noted that from your side, particularly from the Parliament side and the politician side, as you noted, you see an urgent need for real ambition here. Yet at the same time, one of our audience posed a question, as I mentioned, that caught my attention. Is there not a risk by doing this that Europe becomes a regulatory champion rather than a battery champion? Because we have legislation that is aiming to do a particular thing, possibly sometimes if some of the bold choices are not well evidenced. Is there not a risk that we could end up actually being a little counterproductive to our aim?
I don't see the risk, Simon, because if you leave it up to the industry, they stick on their money makers, and that means there is hardly innovation. We see that with food. We are still producing a lot of processed food with huge of sugar in it. And we know that at the end we have to pay for that, but nobody is reducing the sugar. So we need legislation to force the industry to do what is good for the future. Within, of course, frame lines, so that they have some freedom to move, but we have to put a ceiling. And then to react on what Patrick said, the existing directive is on waste batteries. It's only a small part of this regulation. There's a difference between a directive and a regulation. And this regulation is about designing batteries, producing batteries, using batteries, recycling them, and then we have a circular economy. That's the idea behind this. And then you need more text than if you only talk about waste batteries. So, Patrick, that's the reason why it's a little bit longer. But it is for industrial fields more. And I agree at the moment, and that's actually what Jan also said, we don't have at the moment enough recycling capacity. But if we can achieve an export ban of waste batteries, so there's a need to recycle them, then it's I think it's a huge challenge, but also a money maker for the future. And that's what the industry wants. I'm an entrepreneur myself. An entrepreneur wants to make money in a sustainable way normally. But one of the goals is to make money. And if we show you, we bring you the possibilities to create money, to create economy in a sustainable way, what we do is we offer you a level playing field. What we do is actually, we use the leverage of the internal market. Now we still can't do that because we are still richer than the rest of the world. Nowadays we can, but in 20 years we are not able to introduce this type of legislation because then we are finished. And I think that sometimes you have to make a step, and this battery regulation is a small step in really a bright future for Europe on several things: sustainability, energy transition, economy, prosperity, etc. So it's not only one thing we have to face it more as an integral or holistic approach of our industry in the future. And I hope that this battery regulation can be an example for a lot of other industry fields. Thank you.
Indeed, I think it has that very much, as I mentioned at the start, that blueprint role. Well, Patrick, a number of points have been raised there. I think I'll first invite you to come in on, and then I'd like to open up. Julia, I'd like to hear from you on this as well, since a number of points have been raised. And Jan, I'll come back to you as well. So Patrick first. Yeah,
maybe going back to the exchange between Julia and Jan first regarding recycling efficiencies, lithium recycling, science-based numbers versus visions. I mean, we agree there has to be some amount of visions to get the industry, the battery industry, the recycling industry, to move ahead, to move forward, to change the industry, to bring it to a different level. We agree with that. Where maybe there's a bit of a rub here is we do have to consider beyond the EU borders. I mean, we know that the Chinese battery market has been expanding earlier and faster than us due to their move towards electrification, which started before Europe. There is in Asia a flow of used batteries that has started to materialize, before it is materializing here. We have to be a little careful here that if our targets, our recovery targets and our recycled content targets for lithium, for instance, are too high. First of all, if there's not enough waste here in Europe, it will increase the price of recycled lithium at a higher level than primary lithium. And what that will do, very simply, it will increase the cost of European manufacturers, because some raw materials will now start having a higher price than the recycled raw materials will have a higher price than the primary recycled materials. And on the other end, Asian manufacturers who can already rely on a large amount of used battery coming back for recycling will be able to use that flow to serve the European markets. So for them, it's going to be a lot easier than for us to reach higher targets. So yes, there has to be a vision. We understand that. Yes, there has to be a goal. There has to be ambition. But where so I agree with Julia here, but Jan is also right. We have to set those numbers in a way that ensure that sustainability doesn't start to kill the strength of the European industry, if you will. So that was my first one. We have to have the right balance here.
If I can, Patrick, I'll link that back to Julia right now, then I'll come back to you afterwards on the other point. Because Julia, you mentioned in your initial comments that for you sustainability is competitiveness, but what Patrick's mentioning here is if we're not careful on how we make our sustainability targets, in fact, that might not be the equation that takes place. I don't know how you would see that, Julia.
So I think maybe just a clarification to stress the target that the European Parliament is pushing on lithium recovery, 70% by 2026 and 90% by 2030, are not some kind of, fixed numbers that come from nowhere. They come from science-based evidence. There is evidence, there are pilots, and there are companies that are now putting in place processes to achieve those recovery rates. This is really important. It's not just some kind of, an NGO agenda that came from nowhere. This is really important. There is science behind it, and I'm happy to share it with anyone interested to learn more. So sometimes we have a bit of a myth. We say that we're the best in Europe. We do things to the high standards. We do things, in the best way. When it comes to lithium recovery and refining, I fully agree, Jan, with your point there. Unfortunately, it's not so. We are really behind in Europe on our capacity to recycle and refine lithium. And actually, this regulation, by setting an ambitious target, because it is the role of regulators to set the goal of where the industry has to go, by setting that goal, it will create exactly the framework needed for everyone else to work towards it. And it will create the business case, even for refining capacity, to actually be here in Europe, alongside, of course, the demand, which is the electric vehicle market. So that's on recycling. On recovery. On recycled content, we do actually, while we think this target's also important to set this signal, we do understand the concerns of some companies. And actually, I think it's very smart that the European Parliament put in place this review clause for 2027 to actually see if the volumes of recycled content are available. So indeed, we are not in a situation that Patrick was describing, that we actually
This is precisely the concern I was expressing, indeed,
absolutely,
yes.
Buying recycled lithium from China to meet our target. So I agree with that. I really wanted to make a quick point, if you allow me, David, on this regulation versus battery point of view, because I think that's a really important one. Again, we think we're over-regulating in Europe. If we look globally, sustainability of batteries is on the agenda everywhere. There is no week passing in the media, despite the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that there are no articles about the problems in the battery supply chain. People care, companies care. Many jurisdictions, China, US, Japan, are all looking at this. We are in an amazing sweet spot in Europe that we are now setting the blueprint for the global regulations on batteries. If we get this right, if it is ambitious enough, if it's workable, we actually can be shaping global regulations that are yet to come in other regions. And that is a great competitive advantage to our industry, because they will already be ready to actually get other markets.
Okay, thanks. Noted.
David, if I may.
Please.
So, Julia, thank you very much for recognizing the concern that I expressed. I think we see eye to eye here, which is to ensure that there's a balance on the recycled content obligation and the amount of material that will be available out there. Otherwise, we do indeed risk to put ourselves in a hard spot when it comes to the competition from Asia on that matter. Thank you very much. I wanted to add one point regarding this comment you made, which David made regarding whether or not we are a regulatory champion in Europe. I mean, I'd like to take an example from out of this proposed regulation here. I mean, I must say that on some component of this regulation, we are becoming a regulatory champion. I just want to take the example of the hazardous substance management provisions in Article 6 of this proposed regulation. I want to make sure that our audience here understands that hazardous substances in batteries, if this goes forward as it is, will be regulated. I'm talking about the content of batteries here. The use of substances in batteries manufacturing will be regulated through REACH as a whole, with all the different processes, including authorization and restriction, through the ELV directive, which regulates the batteries that go into vehicles, which has specific sections on substances, and through this regulation, which is going to incorporate a REACH-like restriction process as an ad hoc measure in Article 6. This is over-regulation. This is showing that in some instances, we are becoming regulatory champion. I hope that there is a way to streamline the process so that industry does not have to report once in the ELV directive update, the next day in the REACH restriction or authorization process, and the month after that, or the year after that, in the battery regulation restriction process. We have to have one single overarching mechanism to regulate substances in batteries, not three. Is that so unreasonable?
Well, I'll pitch that to Antonius. Antonius, on the one hand, we need ambition, you say, but on the other hand, do we need triple regulation? Do we need three pieces of legislation at EU level that, in a, I would hope, interactive way, actually manage the environmental aspect of hazardous substance restrictions with batteries?
Normally, legislation will shift over each other so that the double parts are looked from top down, that you see the double restrictions. They are the same in the ELD as in the battery regulation. That's, as a lawyer, I say that's what normally different parts of legislation will do. I want to mention what Patrick mentioned in the beginning, but we didn't focus on that. That's enforcement. Because that's very important. I always see that why is the European internal market is not really functioning, because the implementation of legislation and also the interpretation of the judges in the member states is different about European legislation. What we introduced is a battery testing facility, and I actually in the IMCO proposal was even that they can have that they can give an arbitration when there is a complaint of somebody, an industry in Europe, that something is going wrong by import or complying or what else. Then the legal services of the organization said that's impossible, that's breaching the treaty. Then I went to the ECG, and the three judges of the ECG just say simply, if it is in a regulation for a specific industry and you have a European authority, then it's possible that this authority can give an art of an arbitration. And of course, the way to the ECG must be opened at the end. I introduced that. It was voted out. That's a pity, because everybody is believing the legal services in this house. But sometimes you have to go further, and I hope that in the trialogue we can discuss this again. But then the battery competence centers, together with the European testing facility, because that's the same, they can help the industry to solve these double requirements, which are in double parts of legislation, because they are meant to be the same. What we have the same goal. For me, it's the industry. For me, the industry is very important, but in a sustainable way. With this regulation, I think we help the environment to introduce sustainable energy. That's one. We help the industry to create a global level playing field. Second, and third, we export our values. And I think both is in favor for everybody who has a warm heart for EU. That's one. Then another thing what I want to say, we are defending now the existing industry in Europe, but there are hardly battery cell producers in Europe. There are hardly battery recycling industry in Europe, because it's easier to export it, to bring it to India, Africa, to do the recycling. But if we really want to share our values, then we should keep them, this recycling too, within the EU. And then if there is a global level playing field, I really believe that there are a lot of entrepreneurs in Europe who start up a battery cell producing plant, like Tesla is doing now already in Berlin. We have, what's the name, I've got the name, Northvolt, something like that. Yeah, Northvolt, that means there will be, in the future, we need 20 times more battery cell producers. And that's why I think it's also a part for the trialogue to reintroduce the idea for this battery deposit scheme for consumer batteries, that we have a huge amount of money to invest in innovation to produce at the end battery cells produced of European raw materials. Then we don't have to have this debate about cobalt and lithium, etc., which we all have to import within the EU. And a dreamer always thinks that what he is dreaming or she is dreaming, that it is feasible. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Well, we've picked up on a couple of elements there that I want to link a little bit. Our audience are also posing quite a number of questions, which I can link in with what we've just heard to move the discussion forward. I want to link the enforcement idea. Audience members of a variety of different backgrounds are expressing concerns that they see a certain degree of ambiguity about the rules and have concerns about how compliance of any imported batteries from third countries will be ensured. And we've also talked, Julia touched upon the issue, which is one we've heard many times, and especially in the situation of Ukraine recently, about strategic autonomy. We hear a lot in the raw materials area too. And our audience is asking a lot, well, how can we make sure we need to recycle better in the EU. We talk about, okay, we need to produce more in the EU. And my question is then, is this batteries regulation, and will the batteries regulation, when it comes out of trialogue, will it allow us to move forward with that? Does it provide the right things that we need to be able to recycle better in Europe, to achieve better strategic autonomy? I'm going to bring in Jan there, and then Patrick, and then I'll open up to Julia and also Antonius. Yeah. So Jan first, please.
Yeah, maybe a few remarks indeed on recycling and keeping materials in Europe. When the European Battery Alliance was launched a few years ago, we were at close to nothing in Europe, neither from the side of production of batteries and battery cells, neither from the perspective of recycling. But when I see, or when I look where we are today, a lot of investments are not just announced, but are already in an execution phase. So especially when focused now on the recycling, when I see how many initiatives have started, how many initiatives have been announced, and not only from startup companies and junior investors, but also by large companies that really want to invest in recycling and are currently working on it, not just plans, then I feel confident that we will have enough recycling capacity in Europe. And we have to to cluster one way or another. I referred earlier to the lithium refining, because recycling is a multi-step process. You start with collection and dismantling, and then you have some metallurgical first steps, and then you have refining until the battery grade. And we need really the full recycling chain and not just one part of it. And that's important, because as I gave the example of the lithium, it's not enough that we have a lithium intermediate that is then refined somewhere else and to come back under the form of batteries. No, we have to do the full chain in Europe. That's one, but I'm confident that we are going into the direction. But another issue I would like to address is you can have a target and an ambitious target, but and enforcement is indeed another thing, but the formulations should be accurate, and that's something that I'm missing in all the current proposals. Today, it's perfectly possible that a recycling company, announces a recycling efficiency of 90-95%. So you see it on their websites, 90-95% recycling efficiency. But if you look at what they are really doing, and it's fully compliant with current law, they're producing a kind of an intermediate. They say this is end of waste, and everything is recycled. But then starts the refining. And then they are not bound anymore to some objectives, and they lose 50% of what has been so-called recycled. And I think that we have to work on those kind of refining, not in terms of metallurgical refining, but in terms of refining the definitions and calculation methods. And now the JRC started already in how do we calculate the recycling efficiencies. And I think that was maybe one of the things that Patrick referred to, delegated acts. So how to refine that, and indeed the devil, as Patrick says, is in the details. And so we have to make sure that we not cheat ourselves, that we do not create a Dieselgate affair based on, okay, we are compliant with the numbers, but don't ask us how we calculate it. So that's a concern I see for the coming months or maybe years to set real correct calculation methods.
Okay, so the methods for calculation need to be carefully looked at in this trial scenario.
That we do not cheat ourselves.
Okay.
If I may add to what Jan just said, if we just look back a little bit here, the more traditional battery technologies that are placed on the market today, and certainly the most prevalent technology, which is the lead-acid battery technology, has shown an excellent record when it comes to collection and refining, and actual with strong numbers in collection efficiency and refining and recycling efficiencies. And likewise, the much smaller industrial nickel cadmium battery sector, which is 100 times smaller than the lead-acid battery industry, but it's still important for several sectors, has also shown an excellent record when it comes to collection of used batteries and their actual recycling and the reuse of the chemicals extracted into the manufacture of the battery, the use of the metals extracted into the manufacture of the batteries. So there is a long tradition of battery manufacturers and producers to implement take-back and recycling schemes with good take-back efficiencies and good recycling efficiencies. When it comes to lithium-ion, which is not so new anymore, certainly quite recent when it comes to industrial batteries and electric vehicle batteries, I mean, all the odds, all the signs are green. Some adaptation has to happen in the regulation, but again, I don't see why the producers and manufacturers wouldn't be able to duplicate the good success they've had until today. So I would, so it is a matter of shaping the legislation right, but I don't think we should start as on negative terms here. The record is actually very good. And even looking at the portable batteries, I mean, nowhere else but in Europe is there a take-back efficiency of portable batteries, which is 45%, which is now achieved in most countries, and in some countries actually exceeded by quite significant numbers. Nowhere else on the planet does that happen. So we shouldn't be, shooting ourselves in the foot. I think we should be proud of what we've done so far. I think we're showing a good direction to the rest of the world. And if the past is any indication of the future, I think things are looking quite good here. just wanted to add this. Now, if I may, on the debate as to whether sustainability is always supporting competitiveness and innovation, I would tend to say in general terms, yes, I would support that. We did point out to one area, which is when there is not enough recycled material and then prices could increase over primary raw materials. I'd like to point out another area where maybe there could be a conflict between the two. In the industrial battery sector, in which quite a few, if not most batteries, are actually developed for very specific industrial uses, which can vary very, very much. Just look at the industrial products that are put out there. They go from very large sea container sized batteries, 40-foot sea container sized battery that weigh more than 20 tons of industrial batteries, all the way to quite small batteries embedded into your electrical meters or gas meters or water meters that are also very small industrial batteries embedded in which last 20 years in the meters. And maybe they weigh just 100 grams or 50 grams. So you can see the vast variety of products that are custom built, custom designed, custom manufactured for very specific application. For these products, do we want the manufacturers of these products to focus on the past, or do we want them to focus on the future? Why I'm asking the question. Today in the regulation, there is no grandfather clause that allows the continuous placing on the market of these hundreds of custom designed, custom built products that serve millions of pieces of equipment in Europe and elsewhere. With the new design obligations that will kick in the few months and a few years for some of them, what we shall be doing as battery manufacturers will be to focus our research and development people in reassessing this very wide range of products to see whether they comply with the new requirements. All this time that our engineers and scientists will be focusing on working on the past is going to be time and effort, which are not going to be available to develop new products to compete on the world stage based on the new design requirements, again, Asian products. So I would really like that the regulators consider seriously this point, as it has been considered by the Parliament, by the way, for electric vehicle batteries and automotive batteries, and consider extending the provisions that allow the sale of replaced as manufactured principle also for industrial batteries. I think this is a key thing that has to be looked at very carefully in the trilogue. Thank you.
Okay. I mentioned, I mean, we touched upon obviously issues of recycling there, as I mentioned, were questions that are coming up very specifically from our audience. But our audience has a very specific question on recycling I'd like to touch upon as well, which is about ensuring, I'll read out the question to all of you and I'd like your reflections. How can we ensure that the really valuable recycling resources, so EOL batteries, scrap, black mass, stay in the EU and are available for EU recycling and batteries material industries? What I mean by this is I'd like to hear from everyone's perspective, do we feel that in its current form, the batteries regulation will achieve that? Julia, I see you signalling. I'll bring you in first. Jan, I'll bring you in after. So Julia, over to you, and then Patrick.
Yes, thanks, David. So 2 points that I wanted to make, but I'll start with this question. And there was a similar question before as well, you know, so obviously the audience really wants to understand how can we keep these materials in Europe? Mm-hmm. Let's be a little bit honest. The battery regulation is great, but it will not solve all the world's problems, right? It will not be the one answer to our entire strategic autonomy issues we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. It is a set of policies that we need. A lot of them that are industrial policy. A lot of them are and have to do with funding and actually financial support for companies to be setting up facilities, be it about recycling or recovery or refining of lithium. But what I wanted specifically to stress here, overall, If we look at markets that have achieved success, for example, China, and how they are really active in every part of the value chain, what we see and what is important for Europe here with a set of policies is to create the entire value chain of the electrification in Europe and batteries. What do I mean by this? It starts with an electric vehicle market. When you have a sizable electric vehicle market, you get the business case for companies to actually, first of all, produce electric vehicles in Europe. And this is what's happening now. Because we buy enough of them, they no longer ship them, they produce them in Europe. They always produce close to market when it comes to cars. Once they produce vehicles here, you get the business case for battery cell manufacturing. And this is exactly what is happening now. It's not just about European Battery Alliance, it's very helpful, of course, but it is about the electric vehicle market here in Europe, which creates the business case for the dozens of gigafactories that are now starting. And what is happening as a next step, and we just begin to see the seeds of it, is that the more upstream processes come to Europe, cathode manufacturing, refining capacity. There's some good examples with nickel, for example, in places like Finland. So the entire value chain sets up here, but it starts at the big sizable market, the clarity that the product will be sold at the end of the day. So there is another huge policy that at the moment is being discussed alongside the battery regulation as part of Fit for 55 proposals. And that is to move Europe to 100% electric vehicle sales, cars and vans for 2035. This in itself is an incredibly strong policy and signal to ensure that everything else in this jigsaw piece actually happens in Europe, because there's business for all of this to be taking place here. I think that's very important. But I really wanted to add a second point, if I may. There was a discussion, and Patrick mentioned about the REACH regulation, the chemicals, the hazardous chemicals. This has always been a very important point to a number of NGOs. And I also would like to remind all our listeners actually that the current REACH regulation is from 2006. It hasn't been actually reviewed much. A lot has changed in terms of best practice in occupational safety. And the current regulation, the REACH regulation, is actually up for review now. In fact, the process just started in January. So it is not a question of having a number of different regulations. It's about the consistency. We are now updating the battery regulation. We are updating the REACH regulation. We just need to make sure that all of them have consistent, aligned, high-level requirements. And it's not the first time we do this in different regulations. We're doing this with due diligence. We have specific due diligence provisions on batteries in the battery regulation. Given the specificities of this market, it makes sense. But we also have horizontal due diligence directive that is now being discussed and proposed for all sectors. As long as things work together and they are not fragmented, I think we absolutely should support the higher level of protection against the use of hazardous materials as it's currently being discussed.
Yeah, I think your point's clear, particularly linking back to that hazardous substance point you made at the end there, Julia. And it's clear, of course, that there are examples of more than one piece of interlocking legislation. There are many of them over the last few decades. I'm sure we could all agree. But I think we could equally all agree, and I'm sure even from a parliament and politicians' perspective, we could all agree that we do all have case studies of where the synergy between the overlapping policies wasn't as good as it could have been as well, with some negative consequences too. So the point's noted that, yes, it's true that overlapping policy can definitely work, but would you agree, Julia, that there's always a risk with overlapping policies that if they're not well aligned, you can end up sometimes not achieving the aim that you'd hoped to at the beginning?
Well, of course, there is always a risk if policies are not aligned, that they basically don't work and there's a little bit of a mess. I of course agree with that. But I think that's why when it comes to REACH, it's just important to understand that as we are reviewing the regulation, the REACH is also up for review. So the same policymakers at around the same time are discussing it, and we need to just ensure that it is aligned. But we also need to ensure that we take the highest standards when it comes to this, rather than basing things on what is currently in the 2006, what I would say, outdated ways of controlling that.
Okay. Okay. Jan, I believe you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I want to come back on the original question about keeping materials in Europe. I fully agree with what Julia said about the investments and the market creation in Europe, but also at the avoid leakage sites, I would like to make a few comments. First of all, I see a different opinion between the Council and the Commission regarding the waste or not waste status of batteries at the end of their first life. In the Commission proposal, they said, okay, at the end of the first life, before you start a second life, you have to go to the waste status. And that would prevent export reduce the risk of export and the risk of leakage of batteries to go outside Europe, because the regulation on export waste and certainly about hazardous waste is more strict than exporting second-hand goods. So from a perspective of keeping the materials within Europe, that would be better to have this waste status. But the Council changed the proposal into no, you first have to make an assessment, and if it's fit for a repurposing, then it should not be waste. I understand this perspective because that would stimulate the second life business. That's also a very high value, but it would make it easier to export after first life batteries to go to be exported outside Europe. So it is a balance between several values. Another element that could be improved here is when batteries are at the end of their life and really waste batteries, then they can be recycled outside Europe, but the Commission says it should be under equivalent conditions. But the concept of equivalent conditions already exists from the previous, from the current batteries directive. It has never been specified what conditions have to be equivalent. So I think that we can make that more strict, that we say it's about the recycling efficiency and material recovery rates. It's about labor conditions, so occupational health and safety. It's about social and environmental law. So we could area that have to be compliant, that should be equivalent as in Europe. We should not end with batteries we do today with electronic waste. You just look at pictures of electronic waste in Western Africa, in Ghana, and you see conditions that you say, that's something we would not or we don't want to have with batteries. So that's inhuman, and so several good reasons to make very strict conditions for export outside Europe. A third element is the battery passports. So the battery passports should include, and that's where the Council has added an element, also have a deregistration. If you finish the life of a battery, someone has to say, okay, I was the last owner, and now I'm going to do this with the battery at the end of life. It could be an export, but it has to be justified where and how will be then the treatment after that when it is exported. And last but not least, I would like to make a remark on the portable batteries. Patrick said, okay, we have already 45% of collection rate of portable batteries, but when we look at the recycling of portable rechargeable batteries, so the lithium-ion batteries, we are merely at 10, maybe 15%. And that's a leakage. We do not know where they are. We have some ideas, but it's not quantified. But I remind you that is the equivalent of a few middle-sized cobalt mines that we lose every year, that we could use to make much more electric vehicle batteries, because the cobalt concentration in electronic applications it's 5 times higher than in an EV battery. So for 1 ton of recycled electronic batteries, we can make 5 to 10 tons of batteries for electric vehicles. So these are 4 points where we can improve, where we can be more ambitious, Antonius. So there we really have the opportunity to do much better.
Okay.
If I may add here, I think I agree with what you've said, although I think we need to make a distinction between actors who play by the rules and some actors who may not play by the rules. It is important indeed that used batteries go through the waste stage, because in doing so, then you do indeed limit very much the ability to export those batteries. And so this is a good starting position to force batteries to go through the waste stage. in most cases after they have gone through their first life. I would fully support this view. Then you have those entities. There are unfortunately entities, I understand, maybe in the small battery market, which we're not very familiar with because this is not the industry that we belong to. But I understand there may be some entities in the waste industry which are organizing export of batteries which may not be recorded as waste for different reasons, and this should be indeed how do you say in American English, punished to the full extent of the law. This is what needs to happen here. Now, I also would like to share with you that currently, my understanding is that in the field, on the market, when you actually want to ship batteries from a continent to another, and in some instances, we tried to bring batteries from America to Europe to have them recycled in Europe. And I understand this is the same with some other actors try to do it the other way around. It is now virtually impossible to do this. Reasons are that shipping companies do not want to have waste batteries aboard these ships. So there is nowadays a huge barrier in place, which essentially effectively prohibits the shipping of used batteries across continents. Just my 2 pennies here.
Okay, noted on that. Now, if I can, we're about 5 minutes away from bringing our panel to a bit of a conclusion with concluding comments from each of you. And I think there's one crucial area that we haven't yet touched upon. We've talked about recycled content. We've heard about due diligence, hazardous substances. We've heard some comments about carbon footprint, but we haven't yet talked about producer definition. And this is again something that's been chaining in our questions from our audience, that the battery producer definition, I believe, is it in Article 2, has been modified. And I'm interested to know from the point of view of our speakers today, do you see an impact in this? Who now has extended responsibility? Are cell module manufacturers producers? So I don't know who wants to pick up on that question.
I'd like to say a couple of words on this, if I may. What is important, we believe, in the industry is that the entity that has the producer definition, which is a definition for take back and recycling. Bear in mind that the producer definition has no bearing on the so-called Chapter 2, which are design requirements, which fall on the manufacturers, the manufacturing entity, which is not the producer, or the representative of the manufacturing entity. Here we're talking producer definition, which is essentially for Chapter 7, which is take back and recycling. What is important here is that the entity who is the producer should be the entity which can be the most efficient in ensuring efficient take back, because efficient take back is a key parameter of the proper functioning of this regulation. And in the battery industry, who is that entity who can organize the most efficient take back? Well, it depends. There are many business cases, and I can't cover all of them because it's really complex, but essentially there are two major cases. Batteries can be sold either as is to end users for them to hook up to whatever system they need them, or battery can be sold embedded in equipment. It can be a car, it can be a cordless power tool, it can be a very large machine, an equipment or an appliance. And then it is the equipment or the appliance manufacturer, usually referred to as an OEM, which sells the equipment with the battery inside to end users. In the first case, when batteries are sold directly to end users by battery manufacturers or their distribution channel, it seems to us that indeed the battery manufacturer or his distribution channel in the different countries knows where the batteries go, know where the customers are, has provided forward logistics, and is therefore able to provide reverse logistics, take back and organize the reverse logistics and the take back and the recycling. In those instances where the batteries are sold to equipment manufacturers, we sell batteries to whatever appliance manufacturer, and this appliance manufacturer then sells those appliances across the planet, across the world. We don't know where those appliances go. Only the appliance manufacturer knows. He has his own distribution channel. He is present in those countries where he has sold those batteries embedded in machinery, appliance, or equipment, or vehicles. We believe in these situations, it would be much more efficient that the producer status be assigned to the appliance manufacturer or his distribution channel. And this is a view which is fully shared by the auto industry, for instance. Car manufacturers want to be the producer in those countries where they place batteries in the market. They don't want that to be transferred upstream to some component manufacturer, and certainly not to a subcomponent manufacturer like a module manufacturer.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Patrick, I'll pause you there if I can, just keeping an eye on time. I want to give enough time for us just to wrap things up. We've covered quite a broad area in our roughly 60 minutes, and of course this is a big topic, a lot of key elements involved, and I'm sure the dialogue will continue and be ongoing, as it always is on these things. What I'd like to do to wrap things up, if I can, is just give the floor briefly, and I stress briefly to each of you, not for a long list of asks, but perhaps your priority one or two key points, being to our audience, to our fellow speakers, to all of the actors involved in the trilogue discussions upcoming. What are your one or two priority messages for everyone to strongly bear in mind in the trilogue discussions to ensure that we get that balance right between sustainability and competitiveness in the batteries regulation? So Julia, I'll ask you to do first on that, then Jan, and then Patrick, and then Antonius, please. So over to you briefly, Julia.
Yes, thank you. I'll be brief. I think it was a really great debate. I think lots of detail, lots of really interesting insights were shared. I will say two things. Before the ask, I'd really like us to take a step back and actually acknowledge that what we're doing here in this new battery regulation is a blueprint, a life cycle approach, not just to future product regulations, but to global laws around batteries. This is a really great starting point, really. And we talked about various details, but there's so much. I mean, just simple things, what Jan mentioned, the battery passport. It's huge. For the first time, we will actually have traceability across the entire battery value chain for a battery that, for example, we find in our car in the future. That's really huge, and it's really important that we implement these things quickly so we can actually implement them in the real world, and they agreed. In terms of my key ask, I will just like to repeat and stress number one priority for us as transport and environment. We really see, especially in the current really heated debate about raw materials and strategic autonomy, that Europe should use this battery regulation to answer part of the issue when it comes to lithium. We need to increase lithium recovery targets to get lithium quickly, this critical material, into Europe. We are happy to support the industry. You know, there can be pilots, funding, whatever needs, but it just cannot be a missed opportunity for another decade. And I can't agree more with Jan, what he also said about portable batteries. It's exactly the same thing. Cannot waste the urban mine, the huge urban mine we have, especially where we are geopolitically at the moment. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Julia. And with equal brevity, please, I'll hand over to Jan.
Okay, thank you. And my takeaway from this discussion here is that basically we share all the same high-level objectives. We all want to develop a European battery industry, and we want to have it clean and sustainable and this things. And we're also proud, I think, and as Julia also mentioned, we are the first in a kind. So we are making the blueprint of a future product legislation. And only yesterday, the Sustainable Product Initiative was proposed, and the concept of the passports was also launched there. So in fact, we are proud that we are the first in a row of new type of legislation. And although we agree fully on those overarching high-level objectives, sometimes we can discuss on implementation, on how to formulate a target and how to calculate or whatever. And take, for instance, we have discussed quite a lot of on recycled content. we always have to think, what is the objective of recycled content? Is it to increase the volumes? Is it to allocate recycled content to those companies that have contributed to collection? Or we have to think how we can use those parameters in a way that it supports the high-level objectives and not just working to the target, because this is a risk I see with targets that can't work to the target, like a schoolboy that is working to get a high score and not the whole broader picture. We are not schoolboys, and so we really have to think what do we want to obtain with a target, and not, oh yes, I can make a mark, I have achieved this target, and that's something we have to think more about.
Thanks very much, Jan. So Patrick, over to you briefly, concluding comments.
Yes, very briefly. Thank you very much. Thank you very much again for this debate. I fully support these different views. We, the battery industry, fully support these different views. All the right principles are in the proposed regulation. We worked hard. I remember we worked hard 18 months ago to ensure that the carbon footprint would be part of the regulation. Some of us may remember that the very initial proposal from the Commission didn't have a carbon footprint calculation. And the battery industry actually worked hard to get that into the draft regulation. So we're very happy to see that. We're very, very happy to see all these different streams in the regulation. Most of them are very much supportive of a successful battery industry. We need sustainability framework to ensure that we can sustain the test of time and that we shall still be around, not plagued by some horrible scandal somewhere upstream or somewhere downstream. We need those frameworks to make sure that we work right, and they will actually protect us, help us and protect us, I think. Sometimes the knobs have to be turned a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left. We've discussed, when double regulation is there, we need to be careful. Do we really need to double regulate? Isn't it sufficient to regulate just once? I would tend to say yes. Do we need to assign the responsibility to Joe, to Bill, to Mary? Sometimes this needs to be carefully crafted. So there are several knobs that need to be turned exactly where they should be. Sometimes we disagree a little bit where those knobs are today, and it's our role to re-explain and explain and explain again as to why the knob should be in this position rather than that position. So we'll continue trying to explain these points to the regulators. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. And briefly, to wrap things up from our panel, Antonius, what would be your main messages, both for industry, for Julia representing more the NGO perspective from transport and environment, and our wider audience?
Well, my main focus is do not focus only on price, what we did in the past. Only the price and the low cost were extremely important, but this battery regulation and the battery industry will be a key industry for the future of Europe, for our prosperity, for the environment, for people, for the surviving of the EU. And we need for that, we need autonomy. We need an autonomous EU battery sector to survive for the future. That's one. And together, because we have seen the example of the solar panels, we were producing them in Europe, and for the price we went outside and there's no solar panel producer left in Europe. That cannot be the case if we are facing the energy transition. That cannot be the case if we are facing the future of Europe. So we try to avoid this with the battery regulation, and together with industry, together with the governments, and together with the people, I think we are strong enough to survive, and I think we are strong enough to win at the end. That's actually what Johan Cruyff always said. The focus of a football game is that one of the parties will want to win, and if you win, you have the best strategy, the best strategy, and the best, let's say, cooperation of all. And that's what we try to achieve with this regulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of the organisers, Eurobat, Eurometaux and Recharge, our panellists for taking the time to be with us and sharing their views with us and the audience. So with that, I declare the panel now closed, and we'll move on just to wrap up the event to get some reflections on our panel from our last guest. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Rozalina Petrova from the European Commission, indeed a cabinet member of the Commissioner for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries. So I believe Rozalina will be joining us presently. Rozalina, hello.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me. Indeed, my intention was to join from the very beginning, but I was with the Commissioner in Parliament presenting our circular economy package that we published today, yesterday. So today we presented it to the ENVI committee, which actually relates very much to what we have here. And luckily, I managed to return very quickly, so most of the panel I actually followed, and it was a great exercise for what is coming up in the trilogue. So thank you for all your reflections and comments.
If I can, Rozalina, I'll come here. And
sure.
that's my first of about 3 or 4 questions just to wrap up today for you. And I'd appreciate, of course, a little briefness in your answers to respect our audience's time as well. My first question is, in terms of priority, I know that you were able to follow the panel, as you said. I'm very pleased to hear that. What were your main reflections from what you heard on the panel? You've mentioned there that you thought the panel was very much a productive one, but what were the main points that stood out for you from the Commission perspective in what you heard in the panel debate?
First of all, I mean, indeed, taking this step back, what I heard is huge support for our proposal, and this is for the Commission extremely important. And you know that the proposal for a batteries regulation was our first initiative under the new Circular Economy Action Plan. It was new back in 2020. And we really put our best thinking into it. And it is groundbreaking in many, many ways, because there we do many things for the first time. We have the tried and tested tools that we had in the batteries directive, such as collection targets, recycling targets, recycling efficiencies for batteries as a whole. But we have so many new elements there. We have the carbon footprint with declarations and thresholds. We have performance requirements. We have indeed the digital product passport that now will roll out for many other products under the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation. We have also indeed the possibility to set green public procurement requirements. We have new emphasis on reuse and repurposing, and then we also have the recycled content, which is groundbreaking in a way. We have it under the Single-Use Plastic Directive, but for the rest it was new. And indeed, what we are setting here for the first time is those recycling efficiency targets per material. And that is something which is very important to get right, because this is a point where I heard a lot of...
If I can, Rozalina, sure. In fact, you would have heard on the panel, we started our panel off with a couple of polls where we were asking our over 400 registered participants right across the world, actually, not just in Europe, about concerns. And our audience expressed, that were echoed by our industry speakers as well, concerns that not that the batteries regulation or what might come out of the trialogue with the batteries regulation in itself is not fit for purpose. But when we're looking at this idea of sustainability and competitiveness for EU value chains in batteries, quite a sizable amount of our audience and also our industry speakers did express a few concerns about a number of areas where they felt that in the trilogue discussions we need to be careful about producer definition, about hazardous substance restrictions. We heard about duplicate between the batteries regulation and the REACH regulation, the ELV directive. We heard also, you noted the comments about recycled content, some concerns also about whether due diligence will be robust enough in enforcement to keep the materials we need in Europe. And I'm very interested to hear from your side. The French presidency been really clear that they want the trilogue discussions to be concluded before the end of their presidency term. Do you anticipate, from the Commission point of view, that that's a feasible objective? Do you think it's realistic to hope that the trilogue discussions will be concluded before the end or by the end of the French presidency? Or do you think that further time would be needed, particularly in light perhaps of any possible delays that may be influenced by the situation in Ukraine?
Thank you. That's a lot of territory to cover.
Indeed.
But I mean, first on the timing, for the Commission, it's really a priority that the regulation is adopted as soon as possible. Okay. We presented it in a way that is, I mean, that we draw the path, and we did also the math in our assessment of the regulation, and that is something which. Well, at the moment, we are at the phase where the Commission defends its proposal. You know, this is how all the three parties in the trilogue start. So that's why, I mean, it's difficult to say. And of course, the speed of the negotiations will depend on the Council and on the European Parliament. But on the Commission side, we are ready to support for concluding the negotiations as quickly as possible. So that is it. It's a bit difficult to kind of to have the exact timing, because as I said, it also depends how much stuck to their positions all the sides are. But we are ready to help to conclude this as quickly as possible, because we really need to start. I mean, we are already working on the requirements, but we need to start rolling the whole framework. So that's really a priority for us. As regards those issues that were mentioned, I mean that well. On recycling efficiencies, we have to have indeed a rational dialogue on what is possible to achieve. We based our assessments on as I said, as was already said 2 years ago, on the basis that was available there, and all these inputs that we receive today are super interesting. This said, from my own experience in waste policy, I have seen that once that we have targets, it really makes all the actors on the market work together. And then just the change happens. And how far we will get. Of course, if we have lower targets, it means that maybe they will be just met, or if the business see the opportunities, they can be over-met. So and then it will be indeed a matter of the economic equation, whether they're just met to the minimum or whether they're overachieved. And then, I mean that once that all this technology starts developing, we may see that there is further potential. And then at that moment we say, okay, let's bring all the markets to this potential. But these are the kind of the considerations that I have when I look at that. We have to really see the figures. We have to see what is a reasonable level and then really to ensure the availability. I mean, that's why we proposed in the first place. But the levels, I mean, is something that is very important to get right as well. But as I said, I'm quite assured that once that we have these targets, because it's the first time that we have these targets, that they're there, they will already make all the actors in the market work. And that is the most important things to kick off. And then also the recycled content, I myself have done calculation rules actually in the past, so I know perfectly well what is meant here, and that there is also a difference between rules on recycling efficiency, so what comes out of the recycling, also for recycled content. And that's why these two parts play a very important role together, because on the one hand we have to have the let's say the output of the recycling and the waste system, and on the other hand we have to have really the input to the materials. And the main objective for this is to ensure that indeed there is that there is take up of secondary raw materials, and that the market for secondary raw material develops. So that is that's also something which is super important for us. As regards REACH, our intention was, I mean, what we have put on the table is fully compatible with REACH. It's coherent, and of course, the Commission, when we propose specific measures, we always ensure that there are no overlap or that they are coherent. What we wanted also to do is to create an agenda for batteries, a procedure that is coherent with REACH, but where we will really advance on this. And that was why what's important to include this element. Then as regards all the due diligence, I think it's really important to focus efforts where they really matter. I mean, it's we saw this in fighting all the crises that we have. There are efforts that are needed in order to implement various requirements, and then for us, what we have put on the table is focusing efforts where they really matter. Of course, I mean, we'll see with the negotiations how all this goes. And well, I don't think that we'll have time to cover all the territory, but I think that we have it's good that we are now so used to the regulation that what we proposed to like in December 2020 was such a novelty, and now it has become common, and it is really for us it's super important also in the context of our sustainable products initiatives, because it really shows the way, shows also the possibility to align the industry, and then to bring indeed the economic and the sustainability agenda together. So.
Okay, now I'm just about to bring things to a close here. I'm aware of our audience's time and schedulings as well as our own. So what I would say is I have one last question for you perhaps, and it's really almost a yes-no answer that I want from you, although it's hard to give one. Can the audience, can the industry take it that the Commission in trilogue will be working hard to try and ensure that the evidence-based approach that you put in your proposal for the batteries regulation and the points that we've heard about on our panel today about the need for regulatory coherence with other areas, on due diligence, on producer definition, on hazardous substances, could we take it that the Commission will be working hard in trilogue with its partners, and of course the Parliament and the Council, to ensure that the batteries regulation that comes out at the end of the process is really carefully made to ensure that we get sustainable and competitive value chains, rather than that risk we highlighted during the panel, that we could end up as a regulation champion but not the battery champion that we can be and we want to be? Do you think that we can expect a good outcome from the trilogue discussions?
Well, I cannot answer anything but yes to your question. I think that the question was put in a way, but of course the Commission is very much attached to better regulation and so on and so forth. So I mean that these are always our goals to achieve the best possible outcome, the outcome that can work on the ground and achieve the objectives. And indeed, in the current the Russia's war on Ukraine was mentioned a number of times, and this even show more urgently the need to go ahead with our agenda. And yeah, we know that we import many materials, that Russia produces 1/3 of nickel, which is very important for the batteries industry. So all this we are acutely aware of, and we will do our best to both support the negotiators, to the co-legislators, to achieve the best outcome. And also to advance with the adoption of the regulation as quickly as possible.
Well, I think everybody, our audience, the industry and all the other stakeholders involved are obviously looking forward to the outcome of the ongoing and the outcome of the trilogue negotiations with great interest and curiosity. So thank you very much, Rozalina, for your time today and your comments to help us conclude. And so with that, everybody, I'll try and bring our event to an end now. I have two things I want to mention to you in about 30 seconds just to close. So we posed the question, how can we enable sustainable and competitive EU value chains with the batteries regulation as it goes through trilogue and comes out the other side? We've had a lot of views today and some clear points about how that can be achieved. We've also done our best to involve your views as an audience as well on this through the questions. So all I can say is thank you to our audience for being here today and participating so well. And I'd just like to note to you that as you log out now and we finish, you'll find a survey also that you can complete just to give us your feedback on the event. So thank you very much, everybody, and I wish you all very well. And I'm sure, like me, you're very curious to see how this issue evolves in the coming months. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.